Hi everybody, welcome back to Operation Overhaul. In this episode we're really going to get into the mechanical work in the engine. Here's the piston, we've cleaned it up, I've taken the rings off, cleaned underneath them and put them back on again. I'm just making sure now that the gaps in the three rings are orientated at 120 degrees to each other. Now getting the gudgeon pin in can be a bit of a pain, so I'm tackling this from two sides. First of all, I'm heating up the piston and I had the gudgeon pin in the freezer for a couple of days. So that's why I'm wearing gloves to protect my fingers against the heat and the cold. And here we are putting the gudgeon pin in. Now I got it started with my fingers. Now I'm using this cheap grip which I got from B&Q, which has got soft rubber ends, and it's quite good for getting the gudgeon pin to move if it's a little bit stiff. Then I'm going to push it a little bit further in with my hands, and then that last little bit can be a little bit tricky. And again, this is where I find the clamp quite useful, because you can use a socket over one end and you can get quite precise control on the amount of closure as you gently squeeze this in. And if you go a little bit too far, you can just switch the clamp over and come in at the other end with the socket. But in this case, we got it in just right, and now we're ready to put the circlips in. The circlips go into a groove either side of the gudgeon pin. The gap should be equal. This is the kind I use. It's got a little tang on it, that bit that's straighter than the rest. If you're putting the circlip in and you're using one of these ones with a tang on it, just be careful that you don't press on the tang. You don't want it to bend at all. Once the circlip's in, it's a good idea to just turn it around with a pair of pliers so that the tang and the gap are in the 6 o'clock position. There are some people that say that if the gap is in the 3 or the 9 o'clock position, then the up and down movement of the piston and momentum can create a force which makes the clip go together and makes it likely to jump out. I don't know if that's true or not, but putting it in the 6 o'clock's easy, so why not just do it and put it beyond doubt. Next job is to put the barrel on over the piston. So to make it slightly easier, having made sure it's fastidiously clean, is just popping a little bit of engine oil in there as well. And now to pop the barrel on. Now I make no claim to be particularly good at this, but I've never broken a ring yet, so this is how I do it. I've got a bit of old cloth supporting the neck of the piston so it doesn't flop around. I'm wearing gloves because piston rings are sharp and it's easy to cut your fingers. I'm trying to get the barrel on nice and straight, and I'm just squeezing the top ring together so that I can get the barrel over it. Once I'm over the top ring, I then move down to the second ring and do the same process. And the big thing to try and avoid here is to allowing the barrel to drop and break the piston below the one that you've engaged. Now I promised myself I'd wear gloves because I cut my thumb last time. I just can't get the feel. So just on my right hand, I'm taking it off to help me feel the ring that I'm squeezing in. Now you can get a tool to compress the rings, but if you get the one that's sort of binding up with sort of barrel-shaped locks, the problem is that once the barrel's on, you've got to try and get the tool off, and that's a job all of its own. You can get the ones that are sort of like a handheld grip, like an enormous pair of scissors with a baked bean can over the end. I guess they'd be a little bit better. But frankly, you don't need it. If you squeeze the rings together carefully with your fingers, and you do it nice and gently and progressively, and don't rush it, you should be able to get it on without breaking the rings. And there we go. Once it's on, I'm going to move the cloth away and then just try and keep control of the conrod and the piston and slide it all down so that the barrel sits over the studs at the top of the engine. Once the barrel's down, I'm just going to turn the crankshaft by hand and make sure the piston goes up and down really easy with no resistance or scratchy noises or anything like that. Next bit's dead easy. We'll just put the little washers over there, give the nuts and the studs a good old clean, and then we'll wind the nuts on by hand, nice and evenly. By the way, the gasket underneath here is good and doesn't need changing. They're pretty simple and cheap to fit if you need to do it, but mine was good. Once I've wound all of the nuts on, and I'll go down snug by hand, I'll then do them up. There is no torque setting for this in the manual. So if you're using a tool like the one I've got here, you can pretty much go as tight as you can manage with your hand. If you're using anything longer than that, then you would need to be a little bit careful. But this is the kind of tool that would come with the Army toolkit, and you're not going to get enough leverage to strip a stud using that because it's a fairly broad thread. So little bit by little bit, opposite nuts, walk the tension down as much as you can. The head gasket is made of copper. I've got myself a new one because the old one was pretty ridged because it hadn't quite gone in straight. So we're going to anneal this. It should come pre-annealed, in other words softened, but annealing it yourself is not going to do any harm. It'll just put it beyond doubt. So with a blowtorch and using the bluest part of the flame, because that's the hottest part, the tip of the blue that is, we'll just go round and round. I've got some bricks here to reflect the heat as well until we get this thing cherry red. It comes with a little bit of sort of packing paper around the outside, which I have moved away, but any sort of impurities will catch fire as you're doing it, but they'll soon burn off. So round and round we go until the whole thing is cherry red. And then once it is, I'm just going to pick it up with that pick in my left hand, drop it into the water, and that's the process done. It should be nice and soft, and it should form into a good seal when we put the head on. Time to build the head back up now. We've removed the valves in order that we could clean everything, and so now putting them back in we need to lap them in, which is a process which involves a little bit of gentle grinding. So we've got some lapping in paste. Normally you would start with coarse paste and then go down to fine, but because these valves have just come out of the same head, they're not new ones going in, I'm just using fine because they shouldn't need very much. And we pop them in one by one. Get a little bit of rubber hose, which I've heated up to make it a little bit more pliable. I'm going to put that over the valve stem, and then I'm going to rub it between my hands, a bit like a Boy Scout using a piece of wood to make a fire. And the friction that creates as I pull gently back and rub it from side to side should lap the valve in, or just sort of gently grind it in. Now, it's ever so easy to put the wrong valve in here and lap the wrong valve in, which would not be a good idea. So remember that the inlet valve is the big one and the exhaust valve is the smaller one. Don't lap in the wrong valves. Alright, so we're just going to do this process over and over every couple of minutes. When you hear the sound go really smooth, so it doesn't sound like there's any sort of abrasion going on, then just stop, push the valve out a little bit, put a little bit more paste on and start again. And what we're looking for is a nice clean shiny ring both around the valve and around the valve seat, with no nicks or cracks or anything like that. And the width of that ring should be about 1 millimetre or so, perhaps a little bit less than that, but it should be reasonably thick. Now, having smeared these things with grinding paste, the next thing we need to do is clean everything off, because you do not want any of that paste left behind in the head when the engine's working, because obviously it will start to abrade things, and if it starts to abrade the valve guide, then you're going to get exhaust gases going up there and burning the oil that's in there to lubricate it, none of which would be very clever. So into the head, clean everything out. I'm going to go right into the valve seats as well, spraying some carb cleaner down there, in and out with a pipe cleaner, and then finally I'm going to blow it with compressed air as well. In with the exhaust valve first, which is the smaller one. I'm just going to smear the stem with just a little bit of engine oil to make it go in a little bit easier. I'm almost going to put it in the wrong way round. Nobody noticed that, I hope. Right in from the correct way round. And now we can put the rest of it over the top of the stem. So we start with a little collar and a little ring washer which goes on there, and all that does is it helps to centre the spring when you put the spring over. Okay, so there are two springs, smaller one inside the bigger one, obviously, on they go, with the tighter coils closer to the engine. And then we've got a little sort of top hat which goes on the end of the spring, and we're going to get the collets ready to put it on as well. Now here's a good tip, or something I found useful anyway, is just get some general purpose grease, put a little puddle of it onto your workbench or your cardboard and just put a little bit on the collets, and that's because these little feckers, once you try and balance them on the end of the valve stem to get everything to lock, they'll just jump off and laugh at you. So if you've got a bit of grease on them, it just makes them a little bit more likely to stick. Okay, so there's the top hat on the end of the spring. We've got the valve spring compressor. So the one end that you can't see, which is where my left hand is, that's going on the valve itself, and the near end is going over the top hat, which goes over the valve stem. And now we're just going to press the handle and a geometric lock will hold it there. And now we're ready to insert the collets. Now once this thing is on and it's geometrically locked, you need to make sure it's the right sort of tension. That's what the handle's for at the end. If you've got too much tension, there'll be too big a space for the collets and they'll never sit in the right place. If there's too little tension, then there won't be enough of room and you'll be trying to force them in, and that will never work. The best thing I found to put them in is a pair of tweezers. So here we go. And this valve tool is actually really useful. You can move the tool around to change where the gap is around the stem. So you can see if I move the tool up, I create a bigger hole at the bottom where I'm putting the collet in. Getting the first one in is usually fairly straightforward. Putting the second one in is slightly more difficult, and you may well drop them a few times when you're doing this. So make sure that the floor space underneath you is absolutely clear and you know where these things are going to land if they're dropped, because the last thing you want to do is lose one in the middle of the job. Okay, so the idea is to get them placed over the valve stem so that their ridges go into the ridges on the end of the valve stem, and then when you're sure it's there in the right place, as gently as you can, try and take the pressure off. You can see I had one little false attempt there. I started taking it off and the little collet jumped out. It just requires a little bit of patience and a little bit of fiddling. And of course you're bound to drop things. It's a three-handed job really. So just gently keep moving things around and then off we come. And that should be the valve nicely seated. Now, I find it reassuring to put the heel of my hand and push and make sure that I can feel the valve moving up and down against the power of the spring. And there's quite a lot of force on there, of course. And the other thing that I like to do is just take a hammer and just give it a little tap. Not too hard, because you can actually make the collets jump out. But if they're ever so slightly out of position, then this will just chop them where they need to be. But that all looks pretty good. And now, because I put a little bit of grease on the end, I'm going to give it a squirt with a carb cleaner and rub it off with some paper and make sure it's absolutely spotless, because we don't want any grease going in the oil channels. And here's a close-up of how it should look when everything is correctly seated. Exactly the same process now with the inlet valve. I'm going to speed this up because there is no difference. Right, time to get the head on now. You'll remember that these push rod tubes came away with the head when we took it away. They should slot neatly in there. There are some rubber grommet type seal things in at the top, so it should feel nice and firm. It may be worth replacing those if they're at all perished. Now place your newly annealed head gasket on top of the barrel so that it sits nice and square on the hole. If anything can sit square on a round hole. And then we put the head on. And when you first put it on, there's going to be quite a big gap, and you just sort of gently press it down until that gap closes. Now we'll put the 4 bolts in, and we just do them up finger tight, as snug as you can with your fingers, all the time looking at that head gasket, because we're trying to keep it absolutely over its hole. Now, as the head comes down, as you're doing this, it'll get harder and harder to see where that head gasket is. But what you can see, if you look from each of the corners behind the bolts, is a little chink of light between the edge of the gasket and each bolt. And if each chink of light is the same width, then that gasket must be centrally over the top of the barrel. And that's what you really do need to get right. So use a pick or a very thin screwdriver to just gently maneuver it as you bring the bolts down. Only when you're completely happy with that do you start to tighten the head down. And this is a slow process. going from opposite nut to opposite nut, walking them down, getting that tension as much as you can. Because in the process of doing this, you're crushing down the gasket. If you don't do it enough, then what will happen is once the engine's gone through a few heat cycles, it will start to get loose, and you'll get gases escaping from the top of the head. You will then naturally want to go in and tighten them up. And the two that you can see close to you here are easy. You can see them from the outside without stripping anything off the engine. But the two near the valve stems, they sit underneath the rocker cover. So that's the fuel tank off job, rocker head off, oil feed off, to go in and adjust those. And you don't want to have to do that too often. Now we'll place a gasket on top before we put the rocker cover on.
Slight issue here. If I line up the rocker box gasket like that, all the screws will go through, all the bolts will go through the holes, but can you see this oil feed here might get blocked? So I'm going to use a pair of these hole punchers for paper and just extend that hole slightly.
Just a tiny bit that way.
Okay. Yeah, very happy with that. Now, whatever happens, we are going to get lubrication. And we're not going to run dry, and that's how you adjust the flow of the oil flow to the rocker head. Now, there's a real trap for players here. On top of each of these, the valve stems, we have a little cap like this, which is hardened and won't wear out. And it just sits on there like that. And if that's not on there, then the difference in thickness basically obviates any kind of valve timing or setup that you've got. So they've got to be on there. And so there are two problems. One is that you just forget to put them on. And the next one is that when you bring the rocker cover on and place it, it's quite tight as you're feeding it under here, and it's quite possible to just flick one of these off. So you just got to be ever so careful when you bring it over.
So the way to do this is we put it on at the back first over the inlet valve stem, wiggle it in, and as you're doing this, just be careful because that oil line, which is quite close to my left hand, is flopping around. It'd be easy to knock it. And then once it's on at the back, just rotate it clockwise, being very careful that you don't knock those valve stem caps off and that you don't displace the gasket. Gently maneuver it into position, and then you're ready to put the push rods in. Now, to do this, in theory, or if you follow the manual, you should be able to just cant the rocker cover over to one side and gently feed them in. But this doesn't work, there just isn't enough room. So what you'll actually have to do is unscrew the ends, then get the rods in, and then rescrew the ends back in. Now don't worry about the fact that you're going to put these out of adjustment when you do this, because anytime you take the valves out and in again and you lap them in, which you must do, you are going to affect it somehow. So you're going to have to get the clearances right anyway. It's a process that you cannot avoid if you want an engine to run well or even to run at all. So you can see I'm having a good go at doing it as the manual says to get it past, but you can't. You're going to have to unscrew the end. Once you've unscrewed the adjuster from the ends of each of the push rods, they will drop in nice and easily, and then there's just enough room to get in there with your fingers and screw it back in, and then just kind of hook it underneath the rocker arm, which is hiding away inside there in the dark. And with that done, we'll now put in the rocker cover bolts. They're all different sizes, so I've made a little sort of bolt map out of a bit of cardboard here. Normally I just photograph them and then try and copy that. But over the years, these have been replaced with different sizes, and some of them have been helicoiled, so it's all a bit higgledy-piggledy, so it's just easier to punch a few holes in cardboard in this instance. So down we go, finger tight at first, and then we'll work our way round to tighten them down. And of course, it would be very easy with so many bolts to go too tight on one side and not enough on the other. You could warp the rocker cover a little bit, and you could provide a route for oil to escape and to seep down your engine, all of which you would like to avoid. So tighten them down evenly, carefully and progressively. And finally we'll reconnect the oil feed. This is quite a strange joint. It's like ball shaped at the end, So press it on and make sure it's seated properly, and then you've got sort of a collar screw type nut which fits over everything, which you then tighten down. And just imagine if you cross-threaded this, what a world of hurt you'd be in. So do it with your fingers first and make sure it feels like it's going on really nicely, and then we can tighten it up. Anyway, I was going to get into the gearbox in this episode, but this has already run over to 20 minutes. We've done lots of mechanical work, feeling quite manly now, having done all of that. So I think we'll leave the gearbox till the next episode. Thanks very much for watching. Please ride safely. I hope to see you again in the next episode of Operation Overhaul as we get this matchless G3 LWD back to tip-top condition.